Welcome to the North Carolina Botanical Garden. We're excited to have you all here with us today, as well as the folks in Zoom. Thank you for being here. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement here, and we're excited to have another program in our Saving Our Savannas program series about the longleaf pine and some amazing stories about the longleaf pine coming to you today. So David Michaud is behind the scenes a bit today, helping us to pull this through. We've got a new opportunity. We have one of our speakers online with us today and not in person. So stay tuned, and we're excited to move it all forward. So it's really been an honor to work with our two presenters today, Earl and Kevin, on the steering committee of our Saving Our Savannas program. Their knowledge of history and their capacity to present it in such a way that's so easy to take in has been just so wonderful. And quite honestly, if I'd had them as history teachers when I was younger, I probably would have enjoyed history class so much more. It's been a real honor and privilege to be working with them. So I'd like to introduce them and also a special guest that we have with us today, who will provide some music for us. So Earl Ijames is a farmer, historian, and curator at the North Carolina Museum of History, where he has worked since 2008. He has also worked as a reference archivist and photograph archivist at the North Carolina Office of Archives and History. In addition to his work in history, Earl is also a seventh-generation farmer currently farming in Johnston County, North Carolina. He graduated from North Carolina State University with a degree in history and minors in economics, English, and African American studies. Kevin Melvin is an enrolled member of and cultural historic preservation officer for the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. He earned his undergraduate degree in American Indian Studies and History from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. His interests are Southeastern American Indian history and culture, all things outdoors, and classic cars. And when he's not working to preserve and promote Lumbee history and culture, he is working on his family farm in Roland, North Carolina, and spending time with his wife and two daughters. And our special guest today, who you'll hear from first, is Abigail Dowd. Abigail is a Sandhills native here in North Carolina, a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in anthropology. And she's a singer-songwriter whose music is rooted in the longleaf pine ecosystem. And you're going to hear a special rendition from her of Buffaloes in the Savannah. Abigail, I'd like to invite you up here first.
Title until just this moment, and I really like that. Buffaloes in the Savannah. Let's see. I'm gonna sit because this is a new song that I haven't tried playing it standing yet, and I don't play with my shoes on because I'm from the Sandhills and we have sand in our shoes. It's more comfortable to just take them off. I'm a folk singer, and the more people have always asked me, what kind of music do you perform? And the more I perform, the more I realize I am a folk singer. And so about a year ago, I decided to really get into my roots. And I went back to Moore County to a place called Rubicon Farm, where they let me just come and stay in this old cabin that was built in the 1800s. And I slipped in, and for about a week, I just watched and sang and took my shoes off. And I have a friend named Brady Beck that some of you may know. He's a wildlife biologist, and I called him because I got a magazine from the Longleaf Alliance, and on the cover was pixie moss. And I found out that pixie moss is an endangered species that only grows in a few places. One of them is Paint Hill, where I used to take a lot of walks. And so I called Brady and I said, I want to preserve the language of the ecology of the longleaf pines through music, because there's a lot of words and species that we've forgotten. He makes sure I pronounce things right and get my facts straight. So this is Brady Beck approved. reaching for the sky, throwing long dark shadows across the white sand. This land that I come from, this land that I come from, this land that I come from, I know where I belong, I know where I belong, I know where I belong. Mighty pines on fire tonight, clearing out the undergrowth, burning up old scrub so wiregrass can run wild. When I close my eyes, I can almost hear the buffalo running across the endless meadow. Pixie moss is growing in a clearing at the top of the pines, where we find my sisters dancing in the moonlight. Across the ridge, they're singing open the bridge that leads back to Mother Water. Across time.
Next, we'll be hearing from Kevin Melvin.
Hello, everyone. Sorry that I could not be there in person. We're in the process of doing some archaeology, having an archaeological field school down here in Robeson County, and pretty much I can't get away right now, so I apologize for that. But I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started with a little something other here. So, all right. Can everybody, hopefully everybody can see this. And we'll pretty much start from the beginning. So, pretty much everybody's familiar with, Sherman coming through the South, coming up out of South Carolina, Georgia and South Carolina up through this way. One of the big things that we have here in Robeson County, especially amongst the Lumbee people, we have a lot of oral histories that kind of talk about different folks' experience as Sherman's moving through, or his forces are moving through this area. And we're in the process right now of collecting some oral histories and some stories and stuff, and storing them in our archive here with the tribe. So hopefully moving forward, we can have some of those recordings to kind of back up a lot of when we do these presentations and stuff. So, but for right now, we're just going to kind of go through. One of the big things about when Sherman came through this area, it's very swampy. Robeson County is historically, traditionally, is a very swampy place. So when the first Europeans came into this area, the way they describe it is islands of dry land in this massive swamp. Islands in the swamp, more or less. And here are just some images from today. What the landscape kind of looks like. So there's up in the upper left-hand corner, you have an image of the river, and the other two are some swampy areas, some areas around Robeson County here today. But when folks come into Robeson County now, even though it is still very swampy, it used to be a whole lot worse. Roughly about the late 1880s, there was a large effort kicked off at that time to dig canals and drain a lot of the swamps that we have in Robeson County. And the reason for that was to give more area, more land to farm and for residential, for places for people to stay and that sort of thing. So just imagine how swampy it is today, and how worse it was, how much more wetter or whatever it was before these canals were dug. So native peoples living in this area, we had a long history of navigating these swamps, these waterways. Um, and, you know, this is where we lived and hunted and fished and grew crops right here in these islands, on these islands here in this swamp. So you fast forward to when Sherman's troops are moving up through South Carolina. When they get here, they're faced with this massive swamp that was very hard to navigate. So Native people in Robeson County, we were historically we tended to stay neutral in the different wars. So we did have some men that fought in the Revolutionary War on both sides, for the British and for the Americans. We had some men that mustered out in the war during the War of 1812, and we did have some men that actually fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy. But that was the exception to the rule. The vast majority of Native people, Native men in Robeson and the surrounding counties here, tended to stay neutral in a lot of cases. And one of the major reasons that Native men, especially during the Civil War, stayed neutral or didn't go off to fight is honestly we couldn't. So in the 1830s, North Carolina passes a series of laws, disenfranchisement laws, that took away a lot of our rights. One of the things that that those laws done was it lumped Native peoples into a category called free persons of color, in with freed slaves, and just, you know, anybody else that honestly just was not white. And some of the things that happened with that is it took away our right to own firearms. It took away our right to vote, to testify in court against whites. It took away our right to sit on juries, and it took away our right for education. So those laws basically impacted us very negatively, and you had a lot of discrimination. You had a lot of things going on. So fast forward to the Civil War in the 1860s. We're not in a very good place. We're most of us are sharecroppers. We have lost the vast majority of our land, and is tending is sharecropping and hiring ourselves out to wealthy landowners. So we are pretty much poor people. So when Sherman starts to come through this area, we see it as an opportunity to kind of fight back, to push back against those in disenfranchisement laws, and to push back against the white population around us that for quite some time had pretty much relegated us to, you know, slaves, free slaves in a lot of cases. So one of Sherman's, he was quoted as saying that the march through the swamps in Robeson and surrounding counties says is the damnedest march I ever saw. Again, we knew how to navigate these waterways. We knew how to navigate the river and stuff. So, you know, we've seen that as an opportunity to help out in this war effort that in any other way we could not help fight. So another interesting and kind of cool story that kind of ties in with Sherman coming through is the story between Miss Lottie Lowry and Colonel Orland Strong Hayes. And I titled this slide, "A Girl and Her Horse." So when the Union soldiers were coming through this area, they had fought their way through Georgia and South Carolina, and in most cases, their horses were in very rough shape. So one of the first things that they would tend to do when they would move into a new area is to go out, send troops out and everything, and bring in livestock for food, bring in fresh horses, that sort of thing. So the story goes that Miss Lottie Lowry, she was roughly about 14 years old at the time. She's riding a horse, very fine horse, um, from one farm to another to visit some family. Along come these Union soldiers. They take her horse pretty much, and she protested, and wanted her horse back, but they kind of sent her on her way with one of their old broke down horses. Well, she ends up following these soldiers all the way to Fayetteville. They get up there and they camp out for the night. They're in there cooking their dinner and stuff. And she comes riding up on this old tired horse that they had gave her for her nice, fresh new horse. And she's protesting, hey, I want my horse back. I want my horse back. And the soldiers are, telling her, no, go away. It's our horse now. We're not going to give it back to you. Well, the colonel at the time of those troops, that he comes up and he hears all this going on. He comes up and he's trying to figure out what's happening. And Miss Lowry, she tells him, hey, they took my horse. I want my horse back. So he gives her the horse back and sends her on her way. Well, crazy thing is, fast forward to after the Civil War, after the war ends, Colonel Hayes, he's from Ohio, and he goes back home to Ohio, and he gets with his family there, and he talks about this area that they come through, and this nice young lady that he met, the horse situation and stuff, and him and some of his cousins to decide to come back to North Carolina, come back to Robeson County. So when he gets here, he finds Miss Lowry, and again, she's probably at this point 16, 17 years old. And in North Carolina, it was illegal at the time for interracial marriage, so they couldn't marry. But we do know from census records that they live right next to each other, and pretty much because of those laws in North Carolina banning interracial marriage, they couldn't marry, but they ended up having several children together. Colonel Hayes, he became the mayor of what is now Maxton, North Carolina, and Maxton Pond, or Hayes Pond, is named after him. It's pretty much where he lived at on the corner there of that property. And the pond is a man-made lake. And it was dammed up off of what is called Shoe Hill Creek. And again, he was mayor at the time and created that lake. And kind of what fast forwards up into the 1950s is the site of the Battle of Hayes Pond, where the Ku Klux Klan, coming out of South Carolina, decides it wants to come into Robeson County and, quote, put the Indian people in their place. And when they come in, they don't realize that they're facing a whole lot more formidable force than what they thought they were. And the Klan gets run out of Robeson County, and they have never came back. So it's just kind of funny how all that kind of ties in together with Sherman's troops marching through. Kind of crazy thing about Lottie Lowry and Orlin Hayes, again, because they could not marry in North Carolina. Eventually, Mr. Hayes, he leaves and he moves down to Georgia. He marries a white lady down there and has several more children, and that's where he pretty much died of old age, from what I can gather. But if it wasn't for Sherman's troops coming through and taking horses, those individuals would have never met, and we still have descendants of that couple in our community today. I tell people in a lot of cases, we have to acknowledge all sides. As a tribal group, we have to acknowledge all sides of our ancestry. You know, we are Native people. We have a very strong connection with Native communities throughout North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina. But we also have white ancestry as well, and African American ancestry as well. So, in order to we must acknowledge all of those sides to acknowledge who we are as a people. So as Sherman's moving through this area, he pretty much takes it easy on North Carolina. You know, South Carolina was pretty brutal. Georgia was pretty brutal, but he takes it easy on North Carolina. North Carolina was one of the last states to succeed from the Union. So he kind of takes it easy on North Carolina as compared to other states that he goes through. But I also kind of think that, you know, once his first foray into actually North Carolina, he is met by a welcoming people, the Lumbee people. And we helped them cross the swamps and cross the river and everything. So maybe that kind of helped with his mindset as to, I'm not gonna burn and pillage North Carolina as much as I did the other states. But I don't know if that was the case, but I kind of like to think it, you know, maybe we were the welcoming party that saved a lot of that stuff. So, but again, I apologize for not being able to be there in person, and I appreciate your time and everybody for coming. So I'll turn it over back to David and Joanna. Thank you.
It's the winter of 1864 and 1865, and the Union Army is on the march through the southern states of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman has engaged all-out warfare on not only the southern armies of the Confederacy, but the civilian population and the Longleaf pine forest. During Sherman's march of 60,000 troops that leave Chattanooga, Tennessee, down through Chickamauga, Georgia, through Atlanta by July of 1864, reaching the Sea of Georgia and Savannah by November. Sherman declared Savannah to be President Abraham Lincoln's Christmas present. And from there, General Sherman's 60,000 troops, with a gathering mass of freedom seekers numbering in the tens of thousands, began to tread earth from Savannah, crossing the Savannah River into South Carolina, headed toward the total destruction of the state capital of South Carolina, the Palmetto State, Columbia, reaching that destination February 13th, 1865. After completely destroying the state capital of South Carolina, this historian tells people that the famous 1938 film Gone with the Wind, based on North Carolina native Margaret Mitchell's bestseller, that film should have been made about Columbia, South Carolina. And yet, that state has very few records that predate 1865 and Sherman's march through it. And as Sherman turned his army and the guns from Columbia, South Carolina, heading east-northeast into what his soldiers termed, quote, the quicksand of North Carolina, crossing the PD river basins with a swath of soldiers spanning anywhere between 60 and 100 miles wide along the Carolina line, from Anson County to the west, as far east as Robeson County, where you see these fires burning presently. And Sherman's scorched earth policy literally followed through the Carolina pine forest en route to chasing General Johnston and capturing the railroad hub of Goldsboro, North Carolina, a critical supply line to Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia, as well as Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding 93,000 Confederate soldiers in North and South Carolina and Georgia. And General Johnston, as a ways and means to slow Sherman's army, would deliberately burn pine forests and turpentine orchards to not only hinder Sherman's march through the pine forest, but also to engage in guerrilla warfare whenever possible and plausible, all the while exacerbating the Union Army's scorched earth policy by burning turpentine orchards and distilleries along their way. And from Goldsboro, North Carolina, in March of 1865, Sherman's army had completely scorched earth from Goldsboro and Wayne County back to the South Carolina line. Counties including Cumberland, where the Confederate arsenal was located, in Fayetteville, Robeson County, Richmond County, Anson County, Johnston County, Harnett County, and eventually ending with the absolute end of the Civil War in April 1865 in the state capital of North Carolina in Raleigh. And Sherman's arrival at the capital city of the Tar Heel State marked the end of an era. Those turpentine orchards, like those of John W. Hood at the March 1865 Battle of Bentonville, no longer existed. The largest employer in Sampson and Johnston counties, gone with the wind, along with North Carolina's largest industry and a large swath of its virgin and second cut native Longleaf pine forests, up in smoke, gone with the wind. This is your favorite farmer and historian, Earl Ijames. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, here's to the land of the longleaf pine, the summer land where the sun does shine, where the wheat grows strong and the strong grow great. Here's the down home in the old North State. All right. Happy Thursday, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out. It's been my pleasure and privilege and honor to be part of this steering committee. Thank you, David, the world's greatest AV guy. And thank you, Joanna, for our project director and all of our steering committee members here. Thank you, Abigail, so much for that intro. That was beautiful. Give Abigail a big hand. And Melvin, thank you. And Robeson County, I know you're doing some great archaeological work. Can't wait to get to see you. And thank you for allowing me to record your prescribed burn that we did on December 21st, 2023, which was one of the outcomes of this project. And so that fire, when it started, it was such a perfect day. It was a full moon, and it burned perfectly, as the almanac had predicted. And so I took my phone out, and on a whim, I said, this is going to be part of my program of Sherman's march through the pine forests of North Carolina. And so with that, I'd like to begin by picking up on Abigail and thanking her. We've had the opportunity to collaborate since going back to the Bleeding Pines of Turpentine in Moore County back in 2012 and 13. And so we kind of bounce off each other with different types. And so one of the projects that I mentioned to her, you know, she's been tuning in, and I talked about in my last April 11th talk, the buffaloes that used to be in the savannah and how they are now extinct. And so Gone with the Wind actually predates Sherman's March. But so are Gone with the Wind, our native sable palms. They're gone with the wind, almost extinct. And so is our Carolina parakeet. It's gone with the wind and now extinct. And so thinking about this and talking about restoring our ecology and recapturing our history and being able to convey it to others, it comes in perfectly to this presentation entitled, of my part of this presentation, Going with the Wind, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's March through the Longleaf Pine Forest of North Carolina. And so part of what I'm gonna do is kind of mix between the PowerPoint, and I brought some historic maps and images from my collection that I wanted to share and display. A lot of people know about Sherman's March in Georgia. Many people presume it ended in Savannah with the famous 40 acres and a mule speech at the Second African Church there in Savannah. But what I did is to illustrate as best as possible, and David, for the online audience, will provide a copy of this. But this is an 1835 map of the plank roads of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And it's one of my favorite maps, and it's really significant on two fronts, because if you go back to the Revolutionary War, these are also the southernmost colonies that experienced a similar scorched earth when another Earl named Cornwallis came through during the 1780s and 80-81 American Revolution. And so the folks in this part of the world have been literally invaded twice in our country by a foreign power. And so just like a good farmer and Johnston County now native, I like to use duct tape in my presentations. So what I've done is I've duct taped kind of a mimicking of a route of Sherman's March, beginning here in the north on the Tennessee-Georgia line between Chickamauga and Chattanooga. Is where Chickamauga actually is where a lot of the destruction starts. If you're coming down on the southern part of the Appalachian Mountains and you begin to descend into the Piedmont, then that's when you begin to get a lot of your Longleaf pine forests. And so, you know, Sherman comes from Chickamauga in the summer and reaches Atlanta by July. I believe it's the 14th of 1864. And so everybody's familiar with Gone with the Wind, and this is what it depicts. But also, and time didn't permit, but I had an opportunity last summer, the film Gone with the Wind, 1938, Oscar winning, one of the best films in history, it actually mimicked Rhett Butler, who was a rice planter outside of Savannah. And so I had an opportunity to actually film at that site, but we didn't have time permitted. Maybe at the next presentation we can do something like that. But from Atlanta, he goes to Savannah, which, if you know about the terrain, this is the bottom of the Appalachians here, this is the Piedmont, and this is the Georgia Plains. And so across the Georgia Plains is where you're gonna find most of your longleaf pines in Georgia as you head toward the coast here in Savannah. So this about 3/4 inch piece of duct tape is meant to mimic about 60 miles wide of a swath. But it varied because Sherman had about 60,000 troops. But what's happening is when his army shows up, freedom seekers begin to flock from behind plantations and turpentine orchards and fall behind his line, and they form this mass of humanity that treads the earth also to the sea. And so at Savannah, you get what I call the famous 40 acres and a mule speech that everyone refers to, that quite frankly, General William T. Sherman didn't have the authority to do, but it did spur a lot of encouragement, particularly among the free people. But what you see on the screen here, is an image that depicts the total destruction of Georgia. And if you see the railroad lines, Atlanta particularly was known as a railroad hub. And what you see the soldiers doing are creating Sherman's neckties. Literally, they would get fire so hot that they would be able to take railroad irons and twist them around trees in a bow tie fashion. And thus, they become Sherman's neckties. And this was an objective of Sherman in particular, because many of the early railroads traversed through the Longleaf pine forest in order to harvest naval stores. And if you have an opportunity to see the pop-up exhibit over here, there's some naval store related items, which, by the way, naval stores was the largest industry in North Carolina. And it actually is an industry that predates the cotton culture, the tobacco culture, peanut culture, whatever, because I remind people that there were forests there first. And many of the forests were worked and cleared before they were actually cultivated as plantations. So what you see is I had an opportunity back in 2010. I was invited to Savannah as a lecturer and as the official historian for 2010 as the WW Law History Lecturer of the Year. And it was hosted by the Telfair Museum there, a great place. Highly encourage you to go there to Savannah. It's a beautiful place. Sherman didn't destroy it like he did Atlanta. And that's another point. And that's why Savannah has a lot of its cultural heritage still intact today. So, but I'm here in this image at Second African Church in Savannah, the site of Sherman's 40 Acre and the Mule. And behind me, the pastor's podium there is likely where that speech took place. Interestingly, some of the members of the church said, "Oh, Mr. Earl Ijames, let me show you something." And they went to the church pews and they flipped them open and they moved flooring where people could go in the floor and put the church pews back down and actually hide people who were seeking freedom from slavery. And so this is kind of a double goodie for me when I was able to go to this church and get the Civil War history as well as the Underground Railroad history, which in many ways are working in the same. Because if I can go back to this image, if you see the freedom seekers in the lower right-hand corner, they literally would leave the plantations and follow Sherman's army. So my thoughts are that by that time they got to Savannah, there are already thousands of freedom seekers from the Tennessee-Georgia border to the coast at Savannah. So as I mentioned, Gone with the Wind really should have been filmed about Columbia, South Carolina. Columbia was actually one of the targeted destinations of Sherman's scorched earth policy and all-out war on civilians. He aimed to make the Palmetto State pay and the fire eaters because he perceived them as, quote, the cause of the war and the home of the fire eaters and the cause of the war. And what you see is an image of Harper's Weekly that depicts the complete burning and desolation of the capital of South Carolina in Columbia in February of 1864. And so, as Kevin Melvin pointed out, though, when he turns his guns and his armies over the PD River Basin through those muddy swamps into North Carolina, the Tar Heel state, he gives a directive to take it easy on our state because we were, in his words, the last to secede, but as a historian, I had to correct him. We're actually the second last to secede. Our cousins in Tennessee waited a couple days to see what we were going to do, then they seceded. But I like to remind people in Tennessee, they're originally the western part of North Carolina anyway. So what you see on the screen is from the Fayetteville Observer, which describes 5 days of destruction. And so before Sherman gets to Fayetteville, he enters the state of North Carolina on the border. His main army is in Richmond County, North Carolina. And so in Richmond County, Anson County is to the west, and to the southeast of Richmond County is Robeson County. And so on this map, I have a Johnson's 1865 map of North and South Carolina, and also with my reliable duct tape to kind of illustrate the path again. Here's Savannah, and this is November of 1864. And a lot of this area is called the Low Country. In fact, Sherman could not leave Savannah because it kept raining and raining. It was so muddy that he had to bivouac, and he actually formed a pioneer corps to build corduroy roads so that they could get through the swamps and the low country of South Carolina and Georgia in this area. So there's a pioneer battalion that's going in front that's actually a reconnaissance. And pioneers are essentially a fancy name for black soldiers who go, or snipers who go 20 miles ahead, and they cut Longleaf pine trees to a spec. The specs are 24 feet long, 12 by 12, and they would hewn them into blocks and cross-tie them as a railroad. And many times these guys were the biggest and baddest because they would be also in the vanguard, many times encountering Confederates. But in this area here, from Columbia in February and going across Richmond County about March the 1st is here. And there's a church at the time called Temperance Hall. And there's some folks in attendance here from what's now Scotland County. Scotland County was formed out of Richmond County in 1899. But before that time, it was Richmond County. And so there's a church called Temperance Hall. And there's some fine folks from Scotland County here who shared that information with me. And I wanted to acknowledge them. But Temperance Hall would be right here in what's now Richmond County. But Richmond County was not necessarily Sherman's objective, but what Richmond County was one of the largest turpentine orchards left on earth at that time. And literally, if you can imagine the scorched earth policy and the burning of the earth, and then General Johnston, Confederate General Johnston, is in this area here, and they're being compressed back. And so you have the Confederate armies are also doing a Revolutionary War tactic, and that's burning the grounds to create guerrilla warfare because they're outnumbered and outgunned. And so they want to be able to stage a place where they can have battle that would be more advantageous than facing a superior force, say in open savanna. And so many of the savannas and the orchards were burned in this part of the state, as Sherman, his next advancement was the Confederate arsenal and what's now in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And the Confederate arsenal is just what it was, but the arsenal itself, if I can take a plug for our museums, is being remade into the North Carolina Civil War and Reconstruction History Center, and the actual facade of the building is going to be mimicking the old Confederate arsenal. So if you get a chance to go to Fayetteville and check that out, I would highly recommend that. So as we come from Fayetteville, it's about mid-March, and as the screen depicts, it's 5 days of destruction according to the Fayetteville Observer when Sherman and his armies come through. And in the background, you can see the fires that are depicted there along the Cape Fear River. However, I remind people that one of the things that was Sherman's main objectives was destroying Confederate supply lines, namely railroads. His soldiers, I believe, got a thrill out of setting these fires and creating these Sherman's neckties. So as Union General Sherman's main objective in North Carolina was to capture this brand new shiny city called Goldsboro. Goldsboro was deliberately a creation of the railroad. It came about as a direct result of the longest railroad on earth that was completed in 1840. It was originally called the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. It was 140 miles long, and it stretched from the Virginia border, if I could use this Johnson's map here again, from the Virginia border on present-day 95 highway, where Weldon and Roanoke Rapids is today. And that railroad line cut a straight swath to the port at Wilmington. Now that is a lot harder to do than it says, because you have the Roanoke River Basin, the Tar River Basin, the Neuse River Basin, and the Cape Fear River Basin, and the Waccamaw Lumber River Basin that all bisect that. And you're having to traverse it. And along these whole lines are some of the last turpentine orchards, and that's one of the main reasons that railroad was run in the 1830s and 40s was to harvest those last turpentine orchards. And so as this is going on, as the war comes into 1860, it becomes a vital supply line for General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, but also Goldsboro is selected as the halfway site, halfway point on this 140 miles to create a new railroad called the North Carolina Railroad, which leaves Goldsboro, comes up into Johnston County into present-day Selma and Smithfield, and turns into Raleigh, the state capital. And then there's one of the richest men in the country who says, I'm an investor, and I need to have my own railroad hub, and I'm going to call it Duke Station. And this guy is a Cameron. He's one of the richest and wealthiest people in the world. He has a plantation called Stagville, which is a historic site today. And so the railroad goes through, at that time, Orange County. Durham County had not been created. Durham County was created, I like to say gerrymandered, during the Reconstruction in 1880. But from this point, the railroad extends to Hillsboro, across to Greensboro, to Charlotte, and then it will hook into the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad coming from Wilmington here. Charlotte is here, and then Spartanburg, South Carolina, and then from Spartanburg, the railroads will go on toward Atlanta, Georgia. And so those railroads were vital supply lines for both Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army that would be up here in Northern Virginia, and then General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army that literally included Confederate soldiers that had come as far as Texas, across the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and eastern North Carolina. And in fact, his force was larger. It was the largest Confederate force in the history of the war. And so Sherman's objective is to capture this railroad hub. But Goldsboro at that time is also a distillery and turpentine hub, because in the surrounding areas I mentioned to you, this was all virgin Longleaf pine forest in this area going back to Johnston County and to Raleigh. And in fact, I found a Raleigh Register Railroad ad, a Raleigh Register, say that 3 times, Raleigh Register Railroad story in 1840 when the railroad was completed, saying that the first barrels of turpentine that had been produced in Johnston County were for the first time going by rail to the port at Wilmington. And this is only 125 miles, but that goes to show you how much swamp is in there before that time frame. So all of this is virgin Longleaf pine forest leading up to the Civil War that's being scorched earth and overworked because folks are still working the turpentine orchards to produce money for the Confederate war effort. So Goldsboro's the main objective. So one of the people who joined Sherman's army in Goldsboro is one of my favorite people. He is what I call a real Tar Heel. This guy is named Private Jack Sharrett. He was formerly enslaved in Wayne County on a turpentine orchard. And I'll tell you, if you ever want to see a historian's hair grow back, find a Civil War pension application that you'll see on the right that states that he was a turpentiner. And I just flipped out. I say, this guy literally left the turpentine orchards and fell behind Sherman's army. And when Sherman got to Goldsboro, he formed that pioneer corps into the last United States Colored Troop Regiment, the 135th. And I told you about some of their exploits, but in addition to that, they only built the first road between Goldsboro and Raleigh, a corduroy road that I would like to say is a combination of old Highway 55 today and the old Highway 70, not the new one, but the old one. And so we should start an effort to rename that the 135th United States Colored Troop Highway. I'll sign up a petition for that. So, Gone with the Wind. I had an opportunity and the privilege to be on our state Civil War Sesquicentennial Committee. And as part of that, I was asked to do lectures and presentations not unlike the one that you are a part of today. And so about 30 years ago, I had an opportunity to acquire an artifact of the Battle of Bentonville. And I was just giddy over it, but when I started to study the artifact, I noticed two things. This is a London Illustrated News. And I said, my goodness, that war was so significant that a correspondent from London came to little old Johnston County, North Carolina, to cover the war. But then it hit me, it was only the biggest event going on in the world at that time. So here's an original London Illustrated News that's been hand-colored a little bit. And you can see the scene between the Confederates and the Union Army. But what I noticed as a farmer and a historian are the Longleaf pines, of course, and less the soldiers, and also the smoke. Now, another image that didn't make the cut for this particular image came from the Southern Historical Collection, and there's no slight against Carolina or anything, David. But that is actually one of the best images of the Battle of Bentonville, because the caption of that reads, "The total destruction of John W. Hood's turpentine distillery at Bentonville." And when I did some research, I found out that John W. Hood, his turpentine orchard and distillery, which is around present-day Bentonville, which is on the border of Sampson and Johnston County near a place called Mount Olive today, was the largest employer in those two counties at that time. And that was not an anomaly because, as I mentioned, turpentining was our biggest industry. And in fact, our state led the world in production of turpentine from 1710 until the end of the war, when these actions literally caused the destruction of the industry. So I like to give a story about Gone with the Wind that's really based on Bentonville, because Bentonville was completely transformed. The Harper House were the slaveholders there. And the Confederate, Sherman's army, converted their house into a hospital. And those folks, not long after the war, left that area and came into eastern Wake County, where the last virgin, at that time, in the Reconstruction era, virgin forests were in the state. In eastern Wake County, if this is, it would literally be following Sherman's march. Here's Bentonville, 1865 March, the largest battle in the state of North Carolina Civil War. And Sherman's and the 135th create a larger plank road for Sherman's 60,000 troops. And we estimate about 20,000 freedom seekers that literally have followed again from Georgia to Savannah, to Columbia, to Fayetteville. And remember, people are coming behind the lines all along. And then from Goldsboro, people are processioning. But what is also happening here is a place called Fort Fisher, the largest earthen fort in the history of the world. And Fort Fisher is protecting these railroads around the Wilmington and the mouth of the Cape Fear, Wilmington, North Carolina, mouth of the Cape Fear. And remember, these railroad lines are supply lines for the Confederate Army. And so there's another Union general from Ohio named Judson Kilpatrick, who Captain Hayes was likely under the command of Judson Kilpatrick when they come from Fort Fisher up through the eastern side of Robeson County, through Bladen County, Elizabethtown, and Columbus County, and northern New Hanover County, and they meet Sherman there south of Goldsboro at a place called Faison. And there's a house there with still the bullet holes in it, and people said, don't tell me, don't take any pictures, you can talk about it. We still live here. So in Faison, 40,000 troops here, and about 10,000 freedom seekers are joining them. And then there are another 60,000 troops and about 20,000. So if we do 80,000 and about another 50,000. That brings up to upwards of 100,000 mass humanity that's treading the earth after this has been burned. And so if you know how longleaf pine forests grow, once you burn them and you kill the trees or you cut them down for corduroy roads, they don't grow back. Usually a hardwood forest supersedes and invades it. And if you go down what I'm going to call the 135th Highway now, it's mostly hardwoods now, and hideous maple trees and oak trees and all those other kind of hideous creatures that invade longleaf pine forests. So in the beginning of the Civil War sesquicentennial, I gave a lecture similar to this at Bentonville. And so being an outdoor kind of guy, I said, well, after the lecture, we're going to go out, let me walk out in the woods and see what I can see. And immediately I'm noticing beautiful, old, majestic, longleaf pines. But my eye catches two things. Number one, there are no babies on the ground. There were no little longleaf pines. There were no rocket stages like this. There were no grass stages there either. And this was about 1865 to, let's see, my NC State map, 1865 to 2010. That's going to be 145 years, right? 145 years. So 145 years after the battle, there are no babies growing. So alarm bells go off in my head. I begin to tell people in state government, we got to replant. Well, if you want to get something to move in the state government fast, don't tell them. Don't tell them. All right, so, but I discovered also some turpentine hack trees. And I said, whoa, my flat top's growing back. I'm going to get pictures of this. We got to save these trees. And so what I'm pointing to is something that I would like people to look for when you see old longleaf pine trees, because many times the cavity has closed up into almost a surgical precision wound to heal itself. And then the tree, in a way to kind of heal itself, almost covers the face. And so this tree doesn't do justice, but it is actually flat where my hands are pointing there. And, but if you see in the background, that's all googly hardwood junk garbage that has grown up in 140 or 50 years and is strangling these witnesses to the battle. And so when you tell people that the Battle of Bentonville was in a turpentine orchard, well, how can you do that if there were no longleaf pine trees? And so what we have done, and I think at our Longleaf Alliance conference in Wilmington back in 2022, Sarah, we talked about actually getting a ranger to come and partner with Bentonville, a forest ranger, so that a ranger could help educate some of these historian folks and site managers on ways to collaborate and save the natural history part of the battle so that that part could help bring a more effectual interpretation to the battle. Now, all I need to do is for somebody to give us a permit to set it on fire, and we'll have a real battle. Okay, so, but as I mentioned, Hood's Turpentine Orchard and Distillery was the largest employer in Johnston and Sampson counties. Before the Confederate and Union armies scorched the earth, that is. And the turpentine industry with that had gone with the wind. So, Sherman's army and Sherman's march, I remind people, ended here in North Carolina. It ended and was now Durham County, North Carolina. As I mentioned, Durham County didn't exist. Durham didn't exist. That was part of Orange County then. And in Orange County, along the North Carolina Railroad line, there was this poor white farmer named James Bennett who happened to have the serendipity or the bad fortune, depending on whoever you ask, to have Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston and Union General William T. Sherman say, hey, we're going to take your house and we're going to use your house to sign not one but two peace treaties. We won't go into that. That's another whole conversation. However, what I like to tell people is that as you go along the North Carolina Railroad line and you come out of Johnston County here and out across in the Neuse River in eastern Wake County, the coastal plain starts kind of in eastern Wake County on the east side, and on the west side is the Piedmont, and of course we know the Falls of the Neuse up here in this area now is all red clay. There are pine trees here, but most of them are loblolly pines. Originally, there's a handful of just a handful. I've literally counted a handful in Durham to this day. If you see any Durham, Orange County, lonely pines, call me and let me know. We'll have a party at the pine. All right. So, but this kind of depicts the part of the country here, eastern Orange County, where Bennett's Farm takes place here, and is now a state historic site called Bennett's Place. And so they tell this story to people around the world today to remind people that, hey, the war didn't end in Virginia. It ended in North Carolina. And hey, by the way, the largest army was not, Confederate Army was not Confederate General Robert E. Lee, but it was, in fact, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's army. But one of the things, in addition to scorching the earth, and Kevin Melvin gave an excellent example on how the Union soldiers would commandeer things because they lived off the land. One of the things they did is you better hide all your food. You better hide all your gold. You better hide anything valuable because they're going to take it. All right? Now, I'm glad that the Lumbee people treated them good because they got their horse back. But most of the folks whose stuff was commandeered didn't get it back, especially if there were food. One of the things that people took was food. The soldiers took food. So, as I mentioned, the March ends and was present at Durham. Federal troops not only had burned Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina in 60 to 100-degree swaths, 60 to 100-mile swaths, but they also took all the food. So there were people starving. There were real horror stories at the end of the war. But the formerly enslaved people were very, very smart people. They had taken these peas that a lot of people call cow peas or sometimes black-eyed peas, and they start feeding them to the cows. And the soldiers come to say, we don't want cow peas. We don't want that stuff. You keep it. And so what happens is almost in abundance, in the winter of 1864-65, all of the vegetables, crops, your ham, your country ham's gone, all your fish and the salt box are gone, sawmill box are gone, everything's gone in a 60, 100-mile swath. And I like to tell people when Sherman got to Raleigh and he commandeered the state capitol and the governor's mansion, it's right beside a church called Christ Church in Raleigh, and there's a weather vane at the top that's a chicken. And I tell people that was probably the only chicken in Raleigh that was left at the end of Sherman's march when he got to Raleigh. And so free people, in fact, one of my favorite musicians, other than Abigail, who's going to come up later, is a guy named Maceo Parker who created a song called Pass the Peas, which is an old Negro song from the Civil War because the Yankees were not interested in cow peas, AKA black-eyed peas, a crop that was brought from West Africa to Virginia in the 1600s. And it's been a New Year's tradition in our states, North and South Carolina and Georgia, ever since Sherman came through. And people wonder why we have black-eyed peas. It's a tradition that stems literally from Sherman's march. So we're going with the wind. Esse quam videri. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Abigail if she could come back up and share a song that was inspired by our recent trip to Jesse Wembley's farm in April when he had a recent burn and made a remark about some ghost seeds. So she'll tell you a little bit more. So thank you, Abigail.
It's such an honor to be part of this. And I get to perform on stage a lot. And I'm more nervous to do this than I usually am to have a whole show of my own. Especially because this is a brand new song. But I was telling Earl about it, and where it came from is I'm here to wave the banner flag of fire, bringing back the fire. And before we leave, I'd like to read you something that I've learned from my indigenous friends about the time of the 8th fire. But I'll play this song first and tell you that it came out of this research I'm doing for this project. I called my friend Jesse Wimberly and I said, can I come hang out with you? And he was talking about lightning strikes and watching for the west wind because that's the direction that the fire would come. And I was writing this song and it's all dropping in. And then I get a call from Earl and he says, you got to meet me down at Jesse's because this series, we're going to do one on Saturday at Jesse's. And Jesse is working with the Lumbee tribe and had just done the burn. And Courtney is telling the story about how after the fire was reintroduced, as he said, on the full moon, and it is another full moon today, that she went out and she started seeing a plant that she'd never seen. And she asked the elders, what is this? And nobody recognized it. And finally it got big enough that her phone on one of those apps could recognize what it was, and it was him. And all of a sudden you hear this man right here whisper, it's a ghost seed. And that has woven its way into my song. And actually, before I play it, I am going to read you the 3rd verse just recently dropped in. And to me, it represents the time of the 8th fire. And if you don't know what that is, I am not going to pretend to be an expert about it, but I looked it up this morning, and it captures the spirit of why I think today and this series are so important. So, I will not pretend to be in any way a spokesperson for our indigenous wisdom keepers, but this is why I'm here. We have stories of prophets who came to the people a millennium ago to give visions of the future that would come in stages called the 7 fires prophecy. In recent times, there has been talk of an 8th fire in which the ancestor prophets say that to light the 8th fire, indigenous people will come forward with their knowledge, connecting with the Western knowledge, and from this union a new people will emerge, lighting the 8th and final fire. This will begin the golden age of peace. It is this time that the light-skinned race will be given a choice between 2 roads. One road will be green and lush and very inviting. The other road will be black and charred, and walking it will cut their feet. In the prophecy, the people decide to take neither road, but instead to turn back, to remember and reclaim the wisdom of those who came before them. If they choose the right road, then the 7th fire will light the 8th and final fire, and an eternal fire of peace, love, brotherhood, and sisterhood. So I'm going to share a song that I have titled Go Seeds for my friend Earl, who I thank you for allowing me to come.
Here comes the fire, the west wind is strong. Whippoorwill is calling, the days are growing long. Lightning season has begun. Hold the fire and don't run. Don't you run, don't run. The land of turpentine was once an Eden in the past. We are the people who come from people who come from fire. Like the burning sun, fire is medicine. Where the longleaf grows, the ghost seeds know how to hide, waiting for the lightning to strike to set their spirits to rise. There are ghost seeds buried in our chests, the passion and fire that's been suppressed. When we open up our hearts and let the fire grow,
We'll find paradise dwells inside our soul. We'll find paradise inside our soul. Here comes the fire, the west wind is strong, river wind is calling, the days are growing long. Lightning season has begun. Hold fire line, don't run. Don't you run, don't you run, run, don't you run, don't you run. Let the lightning strike and the fire run. Don't you
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you. Well, in rounding up, I want to bring it full circle to a farming, something that is parlayed from farming Lonely Pines. You might say, well, Earl Ijames, why are you holding beer? Well, great question. This is a new beer that is based on an old historic recipe that we were able to research that's made out of pine needles. Pine needles, molasses, ginger, and honey. And a friend of mine and a colleague, Celeste Beatty with Harlem Brew South, who's our state's only African-American female brewer, contacted me in February and says, Earl, you got some Lonely Pines, I know you do, let's do this historic brew and see if we can make it together. So I said, well, this is great, but let's do it one further. Let's name it after who we think might be the first female brewer who's documented in America. And she's a formerly enslaved woman named Piety Cotton, renamed Patsy Young after she escapes slavery seeking freedom. So Patsy Young, in about 1814, an ad is taken out for her, there it is, an ad is taken out for her by her slaveholder, a man named Nathaniel Hunt, who just happens to be a North Carolina legislator at that time. And he says, this lady, Piety Cotton, she's missing. She's ran away, which is kind of a derisive term for a freedom seeker. And he gives a physical description of her, but most importantly, he says, she is a brewer. This is how I make my money. And boy, the afro grew again. I said, wow, this lady's got to be the first female brewer. I said, let's lend her story to this beer. And then there's another famous celebrity who you might recognize on there who might be joining us. And I know I had promised to bring us some for this, but it's still being worked, I think, through a company. But they did send a sample, but I did the best I could to not, well, as a historian and curators, when we get these types of artifacts, we have to empty them anyway. So, but at any rate, this should be coming out, we think, at Whole Foods sometime this summer, being marketed by Celeste Beatty and Harlem Brew South in Rocky Mount, who's been doing a fantastic job restoring an old tobacco warehouse there. So without further ado, I'm going to yield my time over. I want to thank everybody for coming out, and I hope you had a great time. Here's to the land of a longleaf pine, summer land, where the sun does shine. The root grows strong and the strong grow great. Here's to down home in the old North State. Hooray!
Earl and Kevin still with us online. Thank you. And Abigail, thank you all so much for such a wonderful session. And thank you all for preserving this history and sharing it with us today. So thank you all for joining us on Zoom as well for a bit of an extended Lunchbox talk today. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a wonderful afternoon.